perhaps in these times when, on the one hand, socio-political movements such as the Me Too appear to be creating ripples in our midst, and on the other hand, sexual and other forms of violence against women continue to loom at large, the idea of honoring and celebrating the voices of women, as well as the writers who make these voices accessible to us through their prose and verses, happens to be a very novel pursuit. I would like to thank Sandeep sir, Urvashi ma'am, Anita ma'am, and Jerry sir for being here with us today on this very special occasion. Thank you so much, and we look forward to announcing the winner of the award next year, whoever it might be. We will be beginning with a very interesting session at Tolly Club from 6:30 today, the Neta in Post-Truth India, for those of you who might be interested. The next session, The Song of the Road on Travel Writing with Ashwini Devare, Siddhartha Sarma, Prajwal Parajuly, John Zubryzcki, which will be moderated by Sujoy Bhattacharya, will be commencing very shortly, so please do stick around for that. Our delegates are requested to proceed towards the delegates' lounge for the media interaction. I would like to just take a short moment to thank some of our sponsors for AKLF 2019, including our institutional partners, British Council, Prabha Khaitan Foundation, Oxford University Press, Getty Institute, Allier François, Tolly Club and Kolkata Center for Creativity, along with the Australian Council for Arts, the Consulate General of Italy, and the Calcutta Heritage Collective. Our session partners, Kalam, Zuban and Sasakawa Peace Foundation, India Foundation for the Arts, and the Khwaja Ahmed Abbas Memorial Trust. Our promo video partner, Maya BS Art, our wellness partner, VLCC, and of course, our Let's Celebrate Park Street partners, Bisho Bangla, India Hobby Center, Topsell Toyota, Momoso, Bingsho Shatabdi, Rajnikal Sales, Subway, Nexa, Hard Rock Cafe, and TCPL, to name a few. We will be beginning with our next session on travel writing very shortly, so please don't go in.
Tantalizing tales of their far-flung adventures. All of this appears pretty delightful and alluring from the outside, but let us delve into the subtleties of travel writing with our panelists today. They'll be joining us shortly for the session, which starts at 4 p.m. So, our event for today is The Song of the Road on Travel Writing. We are elated to have with us today Prajwal Parajuly, an author whose works focus on Nepali-speaking people and their culture. We are thrilled to have with us Siddhartha Sarma, an author and journalist based in Delhi. His first teen novel, The Grasshopper's Run, won the Crossword Book Award and the Sahitya Academy Award for Children's Literature. John Zubryzcki is an author specializing in South Asian history. Zubryzcki's latest book, Jaduwalas, Jugglers, and Jinns, A Magical History of India, released in 2018, traces the evolution of India's conjuring traditions from the realm of the gods to the domain of daily ritual and popular entertainment. Ashwini Devare is an author, moderator, and a former reporter with BBC's Asia Business Report and CNBC Asia. Ashwini's latest book, Lost at 15, Found at 50, is a memoir that chronicles a lifetime of nomadic living against the backdrop of historic world events. Sujoy Bhattacharya, our moderator for today, is a former consultant for PricewaterhouseCoopers, LLP, Toronto and NYC, and senior advisor to the Government of Canada. He writes under the pen name of S.B. Veda in a world that has almost forgotten what are pen names for. And if you would like any more information about our delegates, please feel free to visit our website, www.aklf.in. I hope these last 3 days has been absolutely mesmerizing with profoundly thought-provoking sessions. And we have more of 2 sessions today, and we are also having our sessions at Allen Park as well as DCPL. Our sponsors and partners for the event. Our tagline for AKLF 2019 is Let's Celebrate Park Street. Let's Celebrate Park Street partners are Bisho Bangla, India Hobby Center, Momoso, Topsell Toyota, Bingsho Shatabdi, Kemold, Rajniknal Sales, Burlington, Matthew, Subway, Nexa, Hard Rock Cafe, Peter Cat, Mocambo, Olipub, DCPL, The Park, Fleury's, Thai Spa, Reliance Digital, Don Giovanni's, Burger Pains. So we will be beginning with our session shortly.
Thanks to all of you for coming and sharing part of your Sunday afternoon with us. I know for many of you, it's the only day you have off, and so it makes your being here all the more precious, and we appreciate it. I have actually written about sort of a global identity and global existences, so perhaps it's befitting that I have the privilege of guiding this esteemed panel through a discussion of travel and writing and travel writing, which I guess strictly speaking is a genre in which authors write about places to which they've been and the experiences they've had. But of course it means other things, and we'll get into that. Contrary to popular belief, travel writing is not a new phenomenon. It's been around for centuries. Perhaps the earliest travel writer was Herodotus, whose seminal work, The Histories, is essentially based on his own travels in what was known then as the ancient world in 5th century BCE. Travel has also informed literature through the ages. One need not go further than William Shakespeare to experience that. His tragedies having been set outside of England, a country outside which he had never been. So how then did he write so authentically about these foreign lands? Interestingly, he spent a lot of time talking to sailors and listening to their experiences, traveling to distant places. And this informed his writing, and the result were classics that we know as Hamlet and Romeo and Juliet and so on. As we fast forward to today, the world has become smaller. Interest in travel writing has been growing, from magazines to newspapers, blogs, and even people posting to Facebook, posting their experiences to TripAdvisor. Travel writing has morphed into something else. It's almost become a very popular pastime. Many of us are now sort of travel writers by default. A word about the title of our session. Song of the Road is a popular translation of Satyajit Roy's acclaimed film, Parajuly. And Pat, aside from meaning road, also means path. And Parajuly is a form of melodic verse that is narrative in nature. So another translation might well be, of the path, story of the path, or story of journeys. So it's befitting that we begin with a writer, Ashwini Devare, who has written a memoir about her own journey called Lost at 15, Found at 50, which chronicles her birth in a strange land, movement to places that are no less familiar, and how these shifts have informed her sense of self. So Ashwini is going to read for us an excerpt from her memoir, and I'll stop blabbing on now and let her words flow on this nice winter breeze that we have.
Thank you very much, Sujoy. Very privileged to be here this evening, and my memoir, Lost at 15, Found at 50, is about my travels to different parts of the world, and it shaped me in many ways. I grew up in Moscow. I was born in Moscow, and then I lived in Sikkim in the 70s before it was integrated into India. So I have a very different perspective on Sikkim than Prajwal, who will be speaking about it later. South Korea, Singapore, the US. So I've been all over the place, which probably is the reason why I'm a little bit messed up. But it definitely shaped my identity in many ways. And like part of the diaspora, the theme, the identity is always that search for belonging, that search for home. And when I was writing this memoir, I didn't know there was a theme until it was over, and then I realized I'm searching for home all through, the book. The excerpt that I'm going to read is from my chapter titled Sikkim, Kingdom of Hope. We lived there from 1970 to 1974. I was about 6 or 7 years old. And a lot of my memories of Sikkim, well, they're like photos in a black and white album, slightly frayed at the edges, but some of them are remarkably well preserved and quite fresh. And I'd like to share one such memory with you today. Suffused by the warm fragrance of silver fern and birch, Dorji and I made our way out of the thicket of trees, our pockets bulging with pointy wooden cones we had painstakingly collected in the forest. A few feet away from us, a carpet of rhododendrons fell across the Himalayan hillside towards the valley below. From our 6,000-foot vantage point, we could see flashes of the river Tista in the far distance, a silver ribbon curling through the rugged terrain of Sikkim, a small kingdom tucked between Bhutan and Tibet. I looked longingly at the flowers, contemplating whether to pluck some to take home. But my pockets were full, and I needed my hands to be free to climb up the hill, steep in parts, to get home. Suddenly it struck me that this patch of fiery red rhododendrons did not look familiar. Where are we, Dorji? We both looked around at our sylvan surroundings, which only a few hours ago had seemed so welcoming, but were now beginning to feel sinister. Just then, I felt something moist on my left leg and noticed a trickle of blood staining my calf. Distressed, I shook my leg violently. Watching the leeches clamber over my thin shoes made me queasy, even though I was used to them in this wild Himalayan countryside that was my playground. Dorji, we must go. I started running, clutching the cones in my pockets, Dorji trailing behind me. Towering in the far distance like a skyscraper was the majestic Kanchenjunga, which the Sikkimis worshipped as their guardian spirit. But at that moment, as its peaks illuminated a dusky sky, they were a forbidding reminder that it was getting late and I needed to be home. I scrambled up a steep slope as fast as my legs could carry me, panting, Dorji, hurry up, hurry up. Dorji struggled behind me, afraid he would lose me if he didn't keep up. He knew that going to my big house guaranteed him a meal, and he had been hungry for hours. Even though we were both 6 years old, I had a maturity beyond my years and felt a strong sense of ownership over Dorji, a local boy who was my closest friend. My mother would call him Shemda Dorji because his nose was always runny. No one really knew who his parents were, although my mother believed he was the child of the shopkeeper who sold momos down the street. Dorji always appeared out of nowhere, just as I returned from school, and we would spend our afternoons exploring the thick forest behind our house. Dorji, I can't see the palace, appeared at the horizon, fear rising in my throat, fervently wishing we had not ventured down a different path today. The palace was our lodestar, a reassurance in this wilderness that home would be just around the next bend in our winding path. Dorji, who had been focused on trying to get through a thorny bush unscathed, stopped and looked around. He too appeared disoriented. I want to go home, I started to cry. Evenings came quickly on the mountainside, and the air felt chilly. Suddenly, Dorji pointed ahead. This way. Imbued with a quiet proficiency that came from his intimate knowledge of the mountains, Dorji was able to get us back on track, and we soon reached the back of the house, wedged halfway up the hill, an old crumbling cottage threatening to collapse from the weight of its age. Flooded with relief, I ran through the backyard and into the kitchen and plopped onto the table, exhausted from our excursion. After a thorough scolding, my mother rewarded us with piping hot momos and warm milk. Dorji ate quickly with full concentration and ran off, presumably back to his family. In Gangtok, we became suspended in time. I didn't understand then that we were sitting on the cusp of history that would forever alter the destiny of both, this Himalayan kingdom as well as ours. Thank you.
Thank you. Ashwini, you mentioned that one of the themes, or the central theme rather, of your memoir is this quest for finding home. Having spent the better part of your childhood and being born and spent the better part of your childhood outside of India. What was it like to come back to India and to come back to Pune to go to school? Because in a sense you were coming home, but it wasn't really home.
You're absolutely right. When I came back to Pune in ninth standard, it was a bit of a shock because I was a new girl all over again, and trying to fit in was hard. But at the same time, this was supposed to be home. But then why didn't I feel like I didn't belong? Why did I feel that sense of alienation? Why was it so hard to fit in? But over the course, as I went through high school and my first year of college in Pune, slowly that feeling of alienation began to slip away. And I felt, all my life I was a chameleon, trying to fit in, trying to assimilate. And here I was finally, where the flora and fauna felt native. It didn't feel borrowed. And for the first time, I felt that sense of belonging. And those 5 years that I spent in India laid the foundation for the rest of my life. I have an umbilical cord, attachment with India, and it has remained. And I think it's those 5 years that really helped put it in place. Thank you.
You grew into India, and India grew on you. Prajwal, Prajwal has written, in addition to doing travel writing, Prajwal has written a collection of short stories and a wonderful novel called Land Where I Flee, in which he explored the theme of coming home. And I know you're going to do a different kind of reading on Sikkim, but I wonder if you could just briefly reflect on coming home, and the fact that you can never, people say you can never come home again, and how that's been for you and how you've worked it into your fiction.
Thank you, Sujoy. For me now, the concept of home is often obsolete. I live among 3 places. I divide my time among India, London, and New York, and I don't know which one of these places my home is. I may feel most at home in New York, but when I refer to home, it's always Gangtok, Sikkim, where I come from. And that's what I write about. The novel that Sujoy was talking about, Land Where I Flee, I've often called a love letter to my hometown. It's a love letter to the Nepali language, which is the most widely spoken language there. And to this date, all the books, or the 2 books I've written, have been about home. I've somehow not been able to branch out. And I also realized so much of my travel writing is about home, which is ridiculous given how much I travel. But yeah, if it's okay, I would like to read a little extract about Sikkim, only because Ashwini read such a fantastic piece about Sikkim from a time that I wasn't even born in. But I would like to read about Sikkim of 2017. This first appeared in Mint Lounge, which was a very good paper at one point, but now reads like a down-market Femina. But so it's called A Home Full of Hotels. Okay?
Yeah, please do.
Yeah. The Chumbi Mountain Retreat in Pelling, West Sikkim, is unlike any other Sikkimese hotel I've been to. Newly built, but with an eye on history, the luxury hotel is almost a tableau of the erstwhile kingdom of Sikkim. Pictures of the last king and his American queen, and the kings and queens before them, deck the walls. The lobby and formal dining area house swords, trumpets, and trunks. I am not staying at the hotel. I know the owners, and I want to avoid the "you're our guest, so we can't allow you to pay" awkwardness that's bound to surface. Besides, on this trip, I'm slumming it. I'm staying at a backpacker's paradise called Kabur. At the Kabur, I pay rupees 500 a night. The most expensive suite at the Chumbi is rupees 36,000. The walls of my room at the Kabur are green with mold. The rooms at the Chumbi look like they've been transplanted from a palace. I've heard rumors that the Chumbi is on the verge of being declared a 5-star hotel. It deserves the tag. I've also heard rumors that the Leela, the Indian chain of super luxury hotels, has expressed interest in running the Chumbi. The small town boy in me is ecstatic. The well-traveled adult in me is skeptical. This marriage of India with Sikkim, I'm convinced, will create disharmony. But I simply have to look at history to know that the union might just work. Sikkim became a part of India in 1975. Apart from the occasional nostalgia for the pre-1975 days, the Sikkimese by and large have made peace with the merger, thanks in no small part to the union government pouring enormous amounts of cash into the state. Families that were struggling only a generation ago are extremely wealthy today. Tourism is booming. Almost every building in the 2-kilometer stretch that is downtown Pelling is a hotel, restaurant, or travel agency. Ever since I became a published author, trips to Sikkim have filled me with dread. The last time I was there, I found myself a clueless judge of the Miss Sikkim pageant and a reluctant chief guest at my school's Golden Jubilee celebrations. I take into account my prolonged lack of productivity. I have produced next to nothing after my second book, which I wrote 3 years ago, and feel like a fraud who will flog his books, I'm still doing that, by the way, for far longer than is acceptable. But because Gangtok, the capital of Sikkim, is home, and everyone in this town does really know everyone, I cannot bring myself to say no to invites. I therefore miserably grace one function after another, making speeches and posing for selfies and declaring to myself that I shall not go home for another 5 years. 6 months later, I'm back doing the same things I promised myself I wouldn't do. Still, I grow disenchanted with this town. We have knocked down old cottages to build ugly flats, which we convert into hotels that we are too posh to run. So we lease them out to a Bengali from Siliguri and laugh about how we are making money without any effort. Our pedestrianized square, the Mahatma Gandhi Marg, is clean and well-maintained and has zilch character. In our attempt to accommodate tourists, we are becoming indistinguishable from other hill stations. Case in point, we now have a cafe coffee day. Thank you. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Prajwal. And I think that I just wanted to add to that point about the Cafe Coffee Day. A lot of these places now, these hill stations, which have had unique character to them, are kind of becoming more homogenized. And that's happening in Sikkim, I gather, as well.
Yeah, it's really tragic, Sujoy. Can you hear me? No? Do you want to use? It's really tragic. There's, I was in Gangtok recently to attend a wedding. I went in expecting to eat nettle leaves and momos and, all these Sikkimese dishes that I hadn't eaten in a long, long while. I mean, what was on the buffet? Chicken tikka masala and matar paneer. It's gotten so bad, and I think one hill station that has still somewhat maintained its character despite myriad problems is Darjeeling. You know, the Oxford Bookstore in Darjeeling, no relation to this Oxford Bookstore, which never stocks books, may look rickety and about to fall, come crumbling down, but it's given the square so much character. We don't have that in Gangtok. You know, we may not have been endowed with the same kind of natural beauty that, say, Mussoorie or Darjeeling has, but we sort of decided to take matters in our own hands, and, we are clean, we have great civic sense, but no, we have no character. I mean, a well-traveled tourist should find nothing in Gangtok, honestly. Sorry. When was the last time you were there?
74.
74, well. Suffice it to say, the place has transformed since then. Well, but it's something that I think this is something that occurs in many cities. I feel that the Calcutta that I knew, in visits from abroad to Calcutta has changed dramatically. It's become much more a generic kind of North Indian city. You no longer hear Bengali songs being sung, on the street. It's all sort of Bollywood film music. Anyway, that's a discussion for another time. Siddhartha Sharma, who's on our left over here, extreme left, has written about the Northeast, in fact, written about all 6 states. And in his book, East of the Sun, he's written 2 travel books. One is called 103 Travels, Trips, and Stuff. Did I get that right? But I wanted to read from East of the Sun because he's written about travel with a sense of humor, with a rather sardonic wit at times. And I'll have him treat us to an excerpt from that, and then I'll ask him about that.
Thank you. So I was about to start out for a bit of travel in the Northeast to research for a novel that I was going to write. And a lot of my friends and colleagues in Delhi, where I'm based, said that since you're going there, you might as well tell us about what you find, which is how this book came about, because I sent them emails about my travels. But I also discovered that a lot of the people who asked me to write about the Northeast were from the Northeast. So that's one of the problems we have. People from the various states in the Northeast don't really know much about their neighbors. So I thought I'd address all their concerns and answer none of their questions. I thought I'd write the whole thing in a humorous way because I grew up in the 80s, and it was a very grim time for us. For most states in the Northeast, there was militancy, law and order problems. There was no infrastructure. So we grew up very cantankerous and morose kind of people. So we tried to escape that by having very distinctive sense of humor. So I tried to put that in the book. So this section is when I am traveling from East Assam to Nagaland. So if you travel along that stretch from East Assam to Nagaland, you have to pass through Dimapur, which is the last town on the plains, and then you climb up the hills to Kohima. So you pass through different terrain and different topography and things. From Digboy, which is an oil township, it's the oldest functioning refinery in the world. From Digboy, I returned west through, counting from right to left on the map, Dibrugarh, Sivsagar, and Jorhat to Golaghat. These are all towns in East Assam. From where I head by night bus south to Dimapur. It rains during the journey, as it has since I left Guwahati. Either a drizzle or a proper downpour, but it rains in a constant torrent the entire time I'm on the bus. This might be a bother if the main body of the monsoon is here already, because it will bring 20 kinds of problems in the hills, the biggest being blocked roads. The route the bus takes is along the rise of the Karbi Anglong hills on the west. This, as I have mentioned somewhere, is a hill district and one of the parts of Assam which was in tribute-paying relations with the Ahom kingdom, which was the kingdom which ruled most of Assam before the British came in. So the Karbis were among the earliest to begin demanding some kind of autonomy or a state, after which they got an autonomous district. Despite this, Karbi Anglong has never really been at peace because of a bunch of different colored militant groups, some of which are so small it is comical. I mean, they could actually be like 5 men with a stick for all their worth, because they've got into the militancy business and, with other groups of little relevance and minor nuisance value, turned insurgency into a cottage industry. You make a group, attack someone as a way to let everyone else know there is a new group on the block, and then get to the really relevant part of the deal, which is designing a symbol. This you get printed on a sheaf of A4 paper, write an extortion note in bad grammar and awful handwriting, and send it to whoever you think has enough money to pay up. Thus, you have a good business running in a place where you'll never find a good job, and if there was a good job, it would go to someone better suited to it, so you will extort from him instead. I should add here that this kind of cottage industry had its golden age a while ago, and things are becoming saner by the day. So this is the part where I thought I'd talk about militancy, because this is actually true. Most of the militant groups in the Northeast, even today, there are about 97 that are still on paper. Most of them are actually men and a stick, and of course a lot of A4 paper. And some of the extortion notes are really awfully written. I mean, if you were to get an extortion note from them, you'd probably not pay them just because they can't write. That has been a situation. It's only the really big militant groups which have editors who can afford them. Alpha, NSC, and the other smaller ones, they're terrible. So if you're okay with it, can I read another small section? So what I also do when I travel, or rather for the past few years, I haven't been traveling, but whenever I visit a rather large-sized town or city, and I know enough people there, I ask them to vote about something that I've had for a few years, which is called city sports. So I think every town or every city is defined by certain things that people do, which is mainly a combination of infrastructure or people's attitude towards urban life or culture, and so on and so forth. For instance, New York City sport is mugging, as far as I am aware. So Guwahati's city sport is called falling into storm drains, because the city has these, it has just two big roads, and we have a waterlogging problem. We've had it for many years. And the city fathers and mothers decided to solve this by building storm drains, which don't work. But they get clogged. So when the rains arrive, when waterlogging happens, the road and the drain, they all get covered. So people don't know which is which. So people keep falling into storm drains, and that's Guwahati's city sport. So I wanted to talk about Dimapur's city sport, which is a little unique because I haven't seen it anywhere else. Since we've been talking a lot about cuisine in Sikkim, here's the other side of the story. Dimapur's city sport is the great crappy restaurant food game, which, if you reach by night bus as is usual, you might have to participate in. Connecting transport from the bus depot leave frequently for Kohima, so you will only have sufficient time for a bite at one of 500,000 eateries in the neighborhood. Speaking of eateries, I do not much like using that word, but I have run out of synonyms for restaurant, and dhaba would be an inappropriate description of these joints. So we'll continue. In these Dimapur restaurants then, which have uniformly rude or squint-eyed waiters and minimal hygiene, the menu at first glance appears to be a delight. You smile a satisfied smile when you read mutton, beef, and pork, but alas, seldom fish. You say to yourself, now we are talking. Here is where we stock up for the uphill stage. You will, however, be mistaken. For the thing that comes floating on a lagoon of oil of dubious nature cannot be strictly categorized in any regular meat grouping. What is it, you wonder? Is it perhaps mutton? But it doesn't have the regular chewiness or salty flavor of good goat meat. Is it beef then? Perhaps. It is definitely not pork, and if it is, where is the 2-inch thick trim of fat that by legal definition should accompany each piece? Did the cook whack it? Is this a new and yet unheard of level of health freakhood, meat from an actual low-fat pig taught from childhood to do weird aerobics? Such vital existential questions are, however, quickly subsumed by other issues, such as the fact that you have yet to unearth, like a neurotic archaeologist, the few bits of meat that are on the dirty plate, underneath the generous heap of ghost chilies, or Raja chilies as they are called, which are extremely hot. While negotiating this degree of hotness unprecedented outside of the legendary Kingfisher calendar and Saturday evenings at the Legend of Rock Cafe in Bangalore, you will then reach the next level of the game, namely, what is all this oil doing here? You see, Naga cuisine is either dry or with gravy, like everything else, but gravy is not oil-based, or rather with very little of it. Onions are another traditional absence. So when you have all these and more, you have to reach in and pull the meat out and eat only those bits with something that might be called roti in a very broad sense. The only good news here is the presence of rice, which is fine by me. Otherwise, invoke the golden rule and improvise. So you make a note of that particular joint and avoid it the next time you're in town. Instead, you very cunningly avoid that street altogether, on the excellent premise that such a diabolical establishment would have corrupted the entire street. You find another place. You find a group of rough chairs and tables with the usual one-leg shot, but these are trifles. You are a traveler, you tell yourself, not a tourist. The food arrives. It was made in the same kitchen as the earlier one and comes on the same plate. They are all in on it, and you can't win this game.
Thank you for that. Humor is a very sharp tool that's often used to dissect issues. I enjoy, I mean, John Oliver, Daily Show, whatnot. But when you're using such a sharp tool, often you can injure, and people can react to that. And I just wonder if you faced these kinds of reactions and how you've dealt with them. Because you don't often find this type of humor in travel writing.
Yes, and it's even rarer for any kind of writing about the Northeast. Funnily enough, all the ex-militants and other people who've read this book, especially the parts where I've talked about militancy and law and order, and I have talked about them irreverently. They didn't have a problem with it. They understood, mainly because they realized that I was telling the truth. The only adverse reaction I've had from the Northeast were when when people from certain states thought that I had described their state in an inaccurate manner, because they have their own definitions of who they are. A particular example that I just remembered, a writer from Meghalaya contested my claim, or rather my statement, that the Khasis were animists before they became Christians. But this is reasonably well established. There is only a small group of people who do not agree to the fact that they were animists before Christianity. So these are ongoing debates. Because my book has covered all 7 states, people from all 7 states had problems with it. But on the whole, it was received rather well, because I also talked about things which even people from those states don't talk much about. The other adverse reaction was from writers outside the region who expected me to write a pedagogic book which used a lot of academic sounding words and deal with the region in a very solemn manner. But I'd been doing it for 10 years, so I thought I'd just take it easy. So that was the other problem that people had with the book.
I wondered too, what was the reaction from the media? Because I think there is kind of an expectation, and people have preconceived notions that travel writing should be, to some extent, very kind of positive, almost promotional. And certainly, after reading about the restaurant, I don't want to go there. So, I mean, did you get that kind of reaction, an adverse reaction from the media then?
So the conclusion that I had after writing the book was, there are all these problems there, but the place is worth visiting. So I've talked about other parts of Nagaland, for instance. If you cross Dimapur, if you don't starve to death, you reach Kohima. It's a wonderful place. So I guess that's what I meant. I said there are problems there, and I'm warning you. If you make a mess of it, you'll know I've already told you about it. But there are also wonderful things to be discovered there, and I talked about them in as much detail as I have mentioned the Dimapur restaurant thing. The only reason I mentioned the restaurant problem in Dimapur is I've never seen it in any other town that I've ever been in. There are always a few good places in every other town. There are 5-star hotels in Dimapur as well, which I suppose have good food. But the local cuisine, not so much.
Thank you. We're going to shift gears a little bit. John has written a number of books, historical books, on topics that are really, I mean, it's, I thought I knew a lot about Indian history before I started reading your works, and now I realize I only know the very broad strokes. I don't know the details. So thank you for that. And you've written about the history of magic in India, and India as a magical place. It reminded me of something I had read, probably read researching you, about Houdini when he was only 19 years old, before he'd become the famous escapologist, doing a show for the Chicago World's Fair in 1893. Incidentally, the same World's Fair where the Parliament of Religions was held and Swami Vivekananda gave his famous speech. And he was doing a magic act in which he was dressed in a white robe and he had blackened his face. And he was, sort of pretending to be this Hindu fakir. And this kind of engendered this trend of all of these magicians who had claimed to have come from the East, and there were these fakirs. And so India had this profile of being this land of magicians and fakirs, and I wonder if you can reflect on this profile and even this kind of challenging that identity as you've researched the topic.
Yeah, thanks very much. I do want to just mention briefly that the Northeast is people always ask me what is my favorite part of India, and I mean, I would have to say Kolkata is probably my favorite metropolis, but the Northeast of India is the most beautiful, most extraordinary part of India. I love going there, and I'm looking forward to reading your book now. But getting back to magic, magic and Eastern India are very closely tied. In Eastern India, particularly Assam, was always considered the land of magic, to the point where invading armies were actually scared of crossing that, going beyond the Dwars into the Brahmaputra Valley because of its reputation for black magic and witchcraft and things like this. They're topics I only touch on in the book, which is really about this interplay of East versus West. So so East meets West, but it was also East versus West as well. And India did have, particularly in the 19th century, when you had this increasing level of disenchantment in the West, because of scientific progress, the Industrial Revolution, and so on, Darwin's Age of Reason, and so on. But India retained this reputation for being this land where real magic might be possible. So if you were a Western magician appropriating the name, an Indian name, blackening your face, donning a turban, stealing some Indian tricks and presenting them to an audience, gave you that extra cachet. It was something that the audiences loved. And India, the whole of India really took on this magical quality to the point that in 1899, the Strand magazine, which was one of the leading magazines in Europe, was interviewing an English magician who'd been to India, and the magazine started off with the statement that ask the average Englishman for what India is best known, and he will ignore the wonders of the Taj Mahal, the beneficence of British rule, even Mr. Kipling, and will unhesitatingly reply in one word: jugglers. Now, juggler, this is why my book's called Jadwalas, Jugglers and Jinns. Juggler was the term for an Indian magician. It became, the common currency for the, this overall, because a lot of these Indian magicians who came to the West in those days did a lot of juggling of balls and other acts of dexterity, as well as sleight of hand. But the name jugglers stuck with them. So I'm just going to read a little excerpt from my book, which is really about this interplay of East and West. That is what most fascinated me. People ask me what made me want to write about Indian magic, and it was exactly this interplay of East and West in this sphere of magic that most fascinated me. In the summer of 1849, the tiny village of Bonchurch on the Isle of Wight witnessed an unusual spectacle. The unparalleled necromancer, Ria Rama Rus, educated Kabbalistically in the orange groves of Salamanca and the ocean caves of Alum Bay, was the most majestic magician ever seen in this part of England. The Eastern conjurer's playbill was impressive. The pyramid wonder was bought at a cost of 5,000 guineas from a Chinese mandarin who died of grief immediately after parting with the secret. The feat of transporting a lady's watch from inside a wooden box into the middle of a loaf of bread took 10 years of study in the plains of Tartary. Another 9 years of seclusion in the mines of Russia was required to master the leaping card trick. Charles Dickens delighted in stage dramas, ghost stories, dressing up, and making magic. His sister Mary recalls 12th night parties where he made children scream with laughter at his tricks. In a letter to a friend in America, Dickens described producing a plum pudding from an empty saucepan held over a blazing fire kindled in Stanfield's hat without damaging the lining, and creating a live guinea pig from a box of bran. The idea to smear his face with boot polish, don a turban, and a costume of silken robes came after seeing Ramo Same. He was a very famous Indian juggler, and his name was probably a corruption of Ramaswamy. He was from South India. Came after seeing Ramo Same perform in the interval of the stage adaptation of Nicholas Nickleby in 1837. Dickens had referred to the South Indians juggling in an unsettled neighbourhood where his local greengrocer on Great Twig Street could always be found practicing Ramo Same with 3 potatoes, juggling 3 potatoes in the air. The name Ria Rama Rus was a corruption of Kia Khan Cruz, who billed himself as the chief of the Indian jugglers and was Same's main rival in the 1810s and early 1820s. Unbeknown to Dickens, his real name was Juan Antonio. He was Portuguese. Cultural cross-dressing spanned magical genres from the Near East to the Far East, but Indian memes were a perennial favourite. Caught off guard by the success of jugglers like Same, Western magicians competed with each other to outperform their subcontinental counterparts, adopting names such as the Fakir of Ava, the Fakir of Ulu, the Fakir of Shimla, and the Fakir of Jaipur. The trend prompted one writer to complain about the Fakir invasion, and I quote, "If there were any towns in India who were lucky enough to escape from these specialists, they must have been confined in Houdini's Chinese torture cell, probably the only place on earth where they would have been secure from confiscation. And every one of these admitted and even openly declared that he himself was the genuine, most exalted, most illustrious, most majestic, and the real and only honest to good actual greatest that ever lived."
Thank you, John. Is it true that your travels through Calcutta inspired you to write about the history of magic? Do you want to just say something about that for our local audience?
Yeah, look, they did. I mean, I first came to the city in December 1976, and I took a dorm bed at the Salvation Army guest house here on Sutter Street, being a backpacker straight out of school. But in those days, as some of you might recall, we have quite a young audience here, but those of a certain generation will recall the streets of Calcutta teeming with Madaris, Jadwalas, Jadugars, whatever you want to call them. There'd be, around the Ochterlony monument, particularly on a Sunday afternoon, you could go there, you could see snake charmers, you could see people with performing bears, you could see Madaris doing sleight of hand. I remember walking down Charingi, and outside the Indian Museum was a boy with his head buried in the sand, and a pile of coins that passers-by were throwing at him. And unfortunately, you don't see that anymore. I was also lucky enough in Alipurdwar to see a performance of the Indian basket trick, which is one of the great classics of Indian magic, where a boy climbs into a basket that's repeatedly stabbed with a sword or a knife. The version I saw ended with the boy being lifted out of the basket with the sword through his neck. And that's something you just don't see these days. And I was, just a couple of feet away from this magician performing on a dusty square without any, stage or props or anything like that, lifting this boy off the ground with this knife through his neck to this, startled crowd, and before putting him back in the basket and throwing a blanket over and doing something, and the boy emerging unscathed. I mean, that was those experiences which, that was 40 years ago, so they didn't exactly lead in a straight line to this book, but they were experiences which I could draw on, from those early travels around India.
Well, elections are coming up, so I'm sure we'll see some trickery on the streets to come in the coming months.
There's a magician friend of mine in the audience who did a fantastic trick at the beginning of my presentation yesterday, as good as any Jadurwalas of days gone past.
The session has been timed near perfectly, so you've all been very good. But I think we have a minute. I wanted to ask, I know that, Ashwini, you and Prajwal share a connection in that you've both met I guess she would have been the Queen of Sikkim at the time, Hope Cook, the American. Do you want to just mention something about that?
Well, I was way older than him, so I had the opportunity to meet the Queen of Sikkim when I was 6 years old, and I have a photograph of receiving a prize in a prize distribution ceremony in my school, a second prize, and from the King of Sikkim, the Chogyal, and the Queen Hope. So I have that very magical memory.
First book came out in the UK. I got a call from my publisher asking me if any big-name author could endorse my book, and I knew nobody. I was still a student then. I was only 26, and I told them, look, I know nobody. And then they asked me if I knew if any of my creative writing professors could endorse my book. I said, no, I don't think so. I mean, it feels extremely transactional. Hey, I've spent $50,000 on this course. Will you please endorse my book? And then they asked me, well, any interesting person, anybody who would somehow be a talking point with the media, et cetera, et cetera. And then I told them, I don't know if this works, but I do know the former queen of the former Himalayan kingdom of Sikkim, who last wrote a book in 1984, the year that I was born in. And ladies and gentlemen, people have had the first books endorsed by Salman Rushdie and V.S. Nepal. I have a book endorsed by Hope Cook, the former queen of Sikkim. And Hope is still alive. She lives in New York. She has just moved to Philadelphia. She's not very happy with me right now because I recently endorsed a book that portrays her in a negative light. Reporters, do not talk about this. Thank you, Diya Katyal. Yeah, it's interesting. Our last queen was an American. I mean, how fascinating is this country, the state's history? This Sarah Lawrence debutante goes to the Windermere Hotel in Darjeeling when she's 23 and finds the king, the recently widowed king of Sikkim, foxtrotting. And, there is a romance there. And then she decides to give up her life in America to move to Sikkim. Now, it's very interesting here because she had to relinquish her American citizenship in order to become the Queen of Sikkim. Now, America is extremely liberal about multiple citizenships as long as you do not accept a title from a foreign government. All right, so yeah, and she became the Queen of Sikkim. She was the queen for a few years. A writer with Calcutta connections, Sunanda Dattare, has been very unflattering in his portrayal of her. But anyway, there is a trouble in paradise. The marriage ends in a separation, a divorce. She goes back to America, but she's sort of stateless. you know, because she had to relinquish her Sikkim citizenship as she was, you know, as a divorcee, she wouldn't be entitled to that citizenship. So there was a big hullabaloo in Congress with I think it was Henry Kissinger or somebody who had to actually fight tooth and nail for her to get her citizenship back. Not the happiest person in the world, but has lived an extremely interesting life. So, yeah.
Fascinating. So now I'd like to turn the panel over to the audience. Does anybody have any questions? I think we have someone with a microphone over there. Go ahead. Is it working?
Hello. My question, sorry sir, I'm not a reporter, I'm just a student, so no worries.
That's just fine.
So my question to Mr. John, well, few years ago when our current Prime Minister took his seat, he said that now we are not a country of snake charmers, but mouse charmers. So do you think that the change which has come in India for quite a while, as you have witnessed it throughout the time, so are we going towards something more productive, or the change is more paradoxical in the sense like something that you have noted in your book itself?
From snake charmers to mouse charmers, I quite like that. I hadn't thought of that myself. Look, it's yeah. Look, no, India is the changes are, you know, are staggering every time I come back. Not always for the better. I mean, you know, it's the growth is very unequal, as you know. In certain ways, India's regressed, in other ways, it's progressed. And I suppose the perception in the West, yes. Look, India is you know, the perception is changing, and that Westerners, particularly, I think, don't see India anymore as a land of snake charmers like they used to. But India, look, India. Perception. The Indian government really needs to do much more in promoting itself abroad. Like the Chinese have got the market cornered. Everything's made in China. Every school kid in Australia just about is studying Mandarin. Every business person in Australia is making a beeline for Beijing. They're not coming to India. So, yeah, more mouse charmers, less snake charmers, absolutely, that would be great. I hope I've answered the question. I'm not quite sure, but anyway.
Someone else? I can say Canadians aren't going. They're arresting us over there. Yes.
Okay, I have a question to the first two authors with respect to, yes, with respect to your writing. You have published writing, right? And also the other gentleman. Now the question is, have you ever come across any literary giant or any other literary person in the Northeast? For example, if you come down below Sikkim, there's a place called Mangpu. And in Mangpu, Nobel laureate Tagore spent a lot of time, and there is a library, there's a lot of other evidence there. So my question is, has it ever taken place in your writing, recognizing the literary giants that might have existed? There may be others who wrote many things, and have you come across that? And if it is it in your writing? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. My writing was very influenced by the accounts that my parents told me, because I was a young girl in Sikkim at the time, a child. So my narrative was shaped by a lot of discussions, conversations that my parents had, which they imparted to me. So, you know, that it's my memoir, which is, you know, perhaps Prajwal might have done that, because his was more academic, and you're from Sikkim. But mine is a memoir based largely on my family's anecdotes and discussions.
Prajwal?
You know, I was greatly influenced by the Nepali writers of the region. Nepali literature is thriving. You know, it's one of those languages where almost everybody has become a self-published writer. It's crazy. And so growing up, I do not read or write Nepali very well, but I still studied Nepali in school and was influenced by writers like Bhattacharya and Indra Bahadur Rai, who is from Darjeeling and passed away recently. And it is tragic that I am not able to do justice to my writing in my language, which is why I do what a lot of us, you know, Macaulay-influenced Indians do. I write in English, and which is kind of sad. But does that answer your question?
Yes, yes. Actually, I myself was in Bangkok. I myself lived in Bangkok as a statistician, okay, because I was employed by the government of West Bengal in the Sincona Directorate. You know, Sincona is the quinine plantation. So, as the other magician writer, John, you talked about magical writing. There are a lot of magical evidence. Evidence means people doing the jugglery and the magic and ghost stories, while I spent about close to 9 months in Mangpu. Now, there are writers in Nepali language, but they are not being heard because they haven't taken any big way in the mainstream of literature. So it would have been nice in your travel writing to get a sample of that, you know. Maybe not now, later on.
You mentioned you regret that you're writing in English and it's a bit difficult. Indian languages face challenges in getting exposure across this country, unless you're writing in Hindi or one of the very kind of states languages that go from state to state. Did you want to say something? No, not in Sikkim. John, did you want to reflect anything about ghost stories or magic in Sikkim while they prepare the next, I think? Okay, another question. A gentleman over here in the red shirt.
Yeah. My question is for Siddhartha, sir. I was wondering if the traveling, the place we are going to, the place we are traveling to, and how much of our mood while we are traveling impacts the tone in which we write that book or the account.
How much of the, I'm sorry, I didn't quite, can you repeat the question?
How much of the mood we are traveling in, are we happy or sad? Does that impact our account or the book that we write?
Right. So your mood while traveling depends on a lot of things, how you're feeling when you start out, and all the different experiences that you go through, and also after you come back home, assuming you come back home and write your account, when you remember your trip, or when you go through the notes that you have taken on your trip, or maybe photographs, or all the other evidence that you have from your trip. So there's a process of revision that takes place, and for some travel writers, it's a constant revision. So you're revising your experience while experiencing it, and while after you come back, you remember it, and then you revise it again. So it depends a lot on the different moods that you have throughout this. For instance, there might have been places where experiences that I have had as a traveler which were not very amusing. But 4 or 5 days later, when I was back at home or at my next staging post, when I was writing down the draft, maybe I reflected on it and I found it funny. So then I wrote it in a humorous manner. Or perhaps what I found funny on the road did not seem quite so funny when I reached the end of it. So the process of revision happens all the time.
I was asking because I listened to your excerpt, and the incident that you talked about, you know, the bad food, and some might take it not in such a funny way, and you took it as funny, and that is something I don't quite understand how you got to that part.
Right. I got to that. I passed through a whole gamut of emotions. The first time I experienced this, the fact that you can't get good street food or low cost, good quality food in Dimapur. The first time I experienced it, I was extremely annoyed. The second, third time, you know, I passed through different kinds of emotions and came to acceptance. So now I have reached the stage where every time I go to Dimapur, I just laugh about it. But the other thing is, the people who find it the funniest that I have talked to, the people who have found this part of the story the funniest, are people from Dimapur, because they know, they are very familiar with it. They've been seeing it since childhood. So I guess you pass through different phases to arrive at a certain conclusion.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, and you can't argue with the stomach. You can feel one way, and then the stomach feels another way. It always wins the argument. I just wanted to ask, just to follow up on his question, my experience has been when you're writing about a place, or anything really, that the longer you wait to actually reflect on it, the more your thoughts or your experience of the place becomes diluted. So I'm just wondering, what your kind of, do you have a process? Do you write things down as you go along, or note down your internalization of what you're experiencing? And how does that impact how you're actually enjoying your travel? Are you able to enjoy it?
I do, but I approach my writing the way most reporters, I guess, do, which is when we are out on the field, we are already working on our copies. And we usually get the rough draft of our story in place before we reach office or wherever it is, and before we start writing down. So that is a natural process for me. So it does not affect what I experience. But what I do usually when I travel, if I plan to write a book on any travel that I do, is I write at the next place where I halt for the day. Unless it's a very long trip and I don't halt anywhere, in which case I come back and try to write.
Yes, Ashwini.
Sorry, thank you. I think when you write a travel piece, the challenges are, like we've seen in all these books, the detailing. It's all about the details. It's about showing, not telling. You know, it's about creating the atmosphere, making it cinematic. So it's almost like you have the, you know, the wide shot, which is the context. Then you zoom in a little bit, you get the content. You zoom in some more, and then you get those finer details. So you have to be able to feel that emotion, which I think we've seen today, and I think that's the challenge of travel writing. Take your reader along with, you know, on a sweep of your journey and get them to feel it, touch it, you know, smell it. It's not something you can, you know, it's not something you can just describe. It's something personal, and I think that's when a travel piece really stands out.
You want to evoke a kind of visceral reaction, the reader going, or in your case, ew, you know, or, you know, this is wonderful. You, sir, in the back.
A question to be taken with a tongue-in-cheek. Okay. The point is, a person in midlife crisis comes to you and seeks advice on becoming a travel writer. What would be? Will he have to bother about where the next meal is coming from?
Well, who would? I can answer that a little later. I'll first give it to Siddhartha.
I think it depends on the kind of journey that you want to go on. So if you're concerned about what kind of food you'll get, or what kind of staying facilities or other infrastructure. Right.
In his life.
Oh, the money part. Yeah. Oh, it's not there. Not at all. So one needs some other kind of job. There's no money in writing, for most writers.
Yeah. I mean, you might be able to get a free trip somewhere or a stay. I'm surprised you didn't take that. I'm surprised you didn't take that. Oh, you don't have to pay. I respect you for slumming it. Do we have another question? Okay, well, the next session is about to begin, and we've, from Shakespeare as global traveler to Dickens in a turban to Queen Hope. I mean, we've captured a number of experiences. I'd like to thank the panelists, John, Ashwini, Prajwal, Siddhartha. Let's give them a big round of applause for sharing with us today. And thank you for coming. And thank you, the AKLF. Enjoy the rest of the festival.